Have you ever experienced an unexplainable sense of unease when encountering certain individuals? As though something hidden yet profoundly disturbing lurked behind their pleasant demeanor. Carl Jung, among psychology's most insightful minds, uncovered a troubling behavioral pattern throughout his extensive clinical practice. There exists a subtle indication that exposes a threat more perilous than any overt physical aggression. This warning sign, often overlooked by our rational mind yet recognized by our deepest survival instincts, doesn't reveal itself through hostile language or obviously toxic conduct. It remains elusive and precisely due to this quality, becomes infinitely more hazardous. Ancient teachings long cautioned against such individuals. Yet Jung succeeded in providing scientific articulation to what our forebears intuitively understood. The most concerning aspect: this warning can emerge in people who seem entirely ordinary, even magnetic in their appeal. When you recognize it, the only rational course of action is immediate retreat. But before we continue, please like this video, share it with people who might find it valuable, and write in the comments which city you're following our YouTube channel from. Shadow displacement represents arguably the most treacherous psychological process Jung identified within human interactions. Picture this scenario. You're engaged in dialogue with someone who abruptly assigns to you motives, beliefs, or harmful characteristics you've never exhibited or demonstrated. This individual isn't responding to your actual self, but to a warped interpretation they've constructed mentally. Does this resonate with your experience? What you're witnessing in that instant is Jungian shadow displacement in its most undiluted manifestation. The shadow embodies everything we disown about our nature. Elements we deem intolerable that we banish to our unconscious realm. Nevertheless, these components don't vanish. They merely exist beyond our aware perception, gathering force within our psychological depths. When someone habitually displaces their shadow onto others, they're displaying the most hazardous indicator Jung recognized: complete incapacity to acknowledge their own rejected qualities. This person literally cannot perceive these traits within themselves. Therefore, they observe them solely in other people. The peril exists in how, from their viewpoint, you genuinely embody those destructive characteristics. Ancient spiritual systems grasped this dynamic millennia before Jung expressed it academically. Buddhism discusses the tainted mirror that reflects personal impurities as external phenomena. Christian doctrine presents the metaphor of the log in one's vision while identifying the splinter in another's sight. What proves truly disturbing is that the shadow-projecting individual remains utterly convinced of their perceptual accuracy. They aren't deliberately deceiving. They genuinely observe in you what they refuse to accept in themselves. This distorted perception creates a specific type of certainty that proves remarkably convincing to observers. The projecting person can persuade others that you match their exact description. Modern neuroscience has validated Jung's theories. Our minds literally screen reality to support our established convictions. However, in instances of extensive shadow displacement, this screening becomes complete reality distortion. Scholar Robert Johnson likened this occurrence to wearing lenses that alter everything perceived. But how do you identify when confronting someone who massively projects their shadow? The telltale indicator emerges when you notice disconnection between their statements about you and your inner reality. They blame you for intentions you've never possessed or assign emotions you haven't felt. Most unsettling, they do this with complete confidence, resistant to contradictory proof. What truly occurs during such encounters? You're witnessing the external expression of internal conflict. This person desperately battles self-aspects they cannot embrace, and you've inadvertently become their battleground. Hell's path is constructed with good intentions, states the old saying. Jung might add, and navigated by those who consider themselves unquestionably righteous. Ego expansion constitutes extraordinary danger precisely because it masquerades as righteousness. When observing someone utterly convinced of their moral supremacy, spiritual infallibility, or absolute truth possession, you're seeing what Jung termed psychological inflation, perhaps the most alarming sign of all. Unlike simple arrogance, which remains easily identifiable, Jungian inflation represents a deeper, more dangerous phenomenon. It occurs when someone's ego merges with archetypal content, particularly savior, enlightened being, or truth-bearer imagery. This person no longer views themselves as limited humans, but as divine or absolute representatives. German mystic Meister Eckhart centuries ago warned about this occurrence, describing it as spirituality's most subtle snare. Zen traditions label it Zen disease, while Sufis reference the luminous veil, more dangerous than darkness's veil because it's much harder to recognize as obstruction. The unmistakable indicator appears when noticing this person never questions their own motivations. While history's greatest sages expressed profound humility before existence's mysteries, those suffering psychological inflation display absolute certainty. They don't consider error possibilities because mentally they're not expressing personal views but universal truths. Particularly dangerous about this condition is its potential for extraordinary charisma. Jung observed how leaders with severe psychological inflation attracted devoted followers precisely due to their radiated absolute conviction. This certainty satisfies our deep human need for security and definitive responses in an uncertain world. Chilean psychologist Claudio Naranjo, a spiritual tradition student, noted that spiritual ego proves most refined and difficult to detect. Ordinary ego declares, "I am significant." Inflated ego proclaims, "I am supreme goodness's channel." This subtle distinction explains why many people gravitate toward potentially dangerous individuals who nevertheless appear spiritually elevated. How to recognize psychological inflation in someone. Observe their reaction to criticism or disagreement. The archetypally inflated person doesn't process questioning as valuable information but as cosmic order offense. They interpret opposition not as legitimate human disagreement but as resistance to good, truth, or divinity they represent. Jung warned this state endangers not only others but primarily the experiencer. Small ego identification with transpersonal content subjects the psyche to unbearable tension, eventually demanding compensation. Greater inflation leads to more dramatic collapse when denied aspects finally surface. What could prove more disturbing than someone displaying exactly what you expect under all circumstances? Jung discovered an unsettling pattern in certain people. Social adaptation so flawless it eliminates roughness, contradiction, or human spontaneity. This impeccable mask or persona, a term Jung borrowed from Greek theater, represents a warning our instincts detect before conscious articulation. Complete persona identification constitutes extraordinary psychological danger because it indicates total dissociation between external image and inner being. The individual has sacrificed authenticity for social acceptance, creating such elaborate facades that they've forgotten what exists behind them. As poet Fernando Pessoa expressed, danger lies not in masks but in forgetting they are masks. Eastern contemplative traditions have identified this phenomenon for millennia. Zen Buddhism discusses the original face before birth, essential authenticity existing beyond social constructions. Taoist masters warned about polishing surfaces so extensively that substance erodes. Jung simply translated these ancient observations into modern psychological language. The warning emerges when perceiving strange artificiality in someone's interactions. Though their behavior remains technically perfect, this person always knows appropriate words, actions, and expressions, yet everything lacks unpredictability and inconsistencies inherent in authentic humanity. As Jungian analyst James Hollis noted, excessive social adaptation perfection often indicates proportional inner emptiness. Contemporary neuroscience has identified fascinating phenomena related to this dynamic. Our brains possess mirror neurons detecting subtle incongruities between others' verbal, facial, and bodily expressions. When someone's social mask completely divorces from inner reality, these neurons generate warning signals we experience as inexplicable unease or distrust. Real danger lies in what extreme dissociation conceals. When someone invests all psychological energy maintaining perfect external images, rejected personality aspects don't simply disappear. They accumulate unconsciously, forming what Jung called shadow. The more rigid the persona, the more chaotic and potentially destructive their shadow becomes when inevitably emerging. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's close collaborator, observed that those presenting perfect social adaptation often experience shadow eruption episodes, moments where repressed energy explodes unpredictably and potentially destructively. This dynamic explains why apparently perfect people frequently prove capable of surprisingly destructive acts. Complete social persona identification represents, in Jung's words, self-betrayal, abandoning authentic individuality for artificial construction. Like all profound betrayals, it eventually exacts psychological tolls. Imagine conversing with someone when suddenly perceiving subtle yet profound change. The same person physically, but something fundamental has shifted in their gaze, energy, presence quality, as if something ancient and transpersonal were manifesting through them. This unsettling experience, recognized by many traditional cultures as possession, was conceptualized by Jung as archetypal possession, perhaps the most alarming sign detectable in another human being. Archetypes, according to Jung, are primordial human collective psyche patterns, structuring forces containing both luminous and shadowy aspects. When archetypes possess someone's consciousness, they lose individuality and become channels for transpersonal energies exceeding their integration capacity. Various cultures' shamanic traditions perfectly understood this phenomenon. Anthropologist Mircea Eliade documented how shamans differentiated between controlled channeling states and dangerous possession states where individual identity was completely subsumed. Christian mysticism spoke of spirit discernment as essential ability to distinguish beneficial from potentially destructive psychic influences. The warning appears when perceiving someone has lost normal psychological flexibility, becoming rigidly identified with single archetypal patterns. It might be the unquestionable savior, relentless warrior, perpetual victim, or infallible judge. The specific archetype matters less than complete identification with it. Revealing indicators include strange eye luminosity, monolithic speech quality, and peculiar feeling that the person is no longer completely present in ordinary senses. As Jungian analyst Robert Moore pointed out, you're not relating to complete human personality but to archetypal fragment that has seized consciousness control. Modern neuropsychology has identified altered consciousness states where certain brain areas associated with personal identity show reduced activity while areas linked to transpersonal experiences are intensely activated. These states, valuable in controlled ritual contexts, can prove extremely dangerous when occurring spontaneously without appropriate containers. Particularly alarming is that archetype-possessed individuals experience extraordinary certainty and purpose. Ordinary consciousness ambiguity disappears, replaced by absolute conviction that can prove extremely persuasive to others. Jung observed how political and religious leaders in archetypal possession states could catalyze mass movements precisely because of this superhuman certainty quality. Fundamental danger lies in archetypes as collective unconscious primordial patterns containing extreme polarities. The same savior archetype contains both redemptive compassion potential and destructive fanaticism. When someone becomes completely archetypal identified, they inevitably manifest its darkest aspects, often without contradiction awareness. Jung documented numerous cases where archetype-possessed individuals committed acts completely contrary to their conscious values, later experiencing partial amnesia or extreme rationalization. Archetypal possession represents temporary self-reflection capacity loss, precisely what makes us human. There exists a psychological phenomenon so disturbing that recognizing it in someone reveals witnessing genuine tragedy in development. Jung called it repetition compulsion, an unconscious pattern where people obsessively recreate identical painful situations as if trapped in invisible labyrinths from which they cannot escape. This signal, when clearly detected, warns us we're facing extraordinary danger, involvement in psychological drama that doesn't belong to us. What proves truly alarming about repetition compulsion is its automatic, unconscious quality. The person isn't consciously or maliciously choosing to recreate destructive patterns. They're responding to deep psychic forces operating completely outside consciousness. As psychoanalyst Christopher Ballas expressed, they are unthought knowns, formative experiences so early or traumatic they were never cognitively processed but organize all subsequent experience. Spiritual traditions have recognized this phenomenon for millennia. Buddhism's karma concept originally didn't refer to cosmic reward-punishment systems but precisely to these conditioning patterns leading us to recreate similar circumstances repeatedly. In Judeo-Christian tradition, original sin can be interpreted psychologically as these unconscious patterns we inherit and perpetuate without conscious choice. The revealing sign appears when observing someone consistently ending up in identical painful situations with different people but following amazingly similar scripts. Even more disturbing, the person seems genuinely surprised each time patterns repeat, as if they were destiny's victims instead of unconscious architects of their recurring experiences. Contemporary neuroscience has discovered biological bases for this phenomenon. Early experiences, especially traumatic ones, literally create neural pathways becoming information processing paths of least resistance. Brains develop neurological expectations unconsciously seeking to confirm pre-existing world models, even when these models produce suffering. The most dangerous aspect is that people trapped in unconscious repetition compulsions unconsciously try recruiting others to play roles in their unresolved internal dramas. As psychoanalyst Donald Kalsched pointed out, unprocessed trauma demands to be staged. Without realizing it, we can find ourselves playing roles in stories that began long before meeting these people. Jung observed fascinating phenomena. The more unconscious the repetition compulsion, the more it seems manifesting as synchronicities or significant coincidences in external life. People unconsciously create situations replicating their unresolved internal dynamics but experience these events as if imposed by cruel or unjust external fate. Jungian therapists identify this signal when hearing someone repeatedly narrate stories where they're always betrayed, abandoned, misunderstood, or victimized in surprisingly similar ways. As Marie-Louise von Franz expressed, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Most disturbing is repetition compulsion's almost magnetic quality. People trapped in these patterns unconsciously emit signals attracting precisely those who can help them recreate their original traumatic scenarios. Jung called this phenomenon negative synchronicity, the extraordinary unconscious ability to orchestrate encounters, perpetuating its unresolved patterns. If the signals we've explored reveal deepest dangers according to Jung, there exists a transformative path transcending these threats: conscious shadow integration. This process represents the fundamental difference between psychologically dangerous people and those who have embarked on journeys toward psychic wholeness. The fascinating thing is we can recognize this integration as clearly as we identify its absence. When we perceive it in someone, we're facing psychological danger's antithesis. Shadow integration doesn't mean moral perfection or negative aspects absence. Conversely, it implies humble, conscious recognition of one's own capacity for all errors and darkness we observe in others. As Jung expressed, "I would rather be whole than good," a frequently misunderstood phrase really pointing to differences between authentic psychological integrity and perfection masks hiding dangerous internal divisions. Contemplative traditions have articulated this process for millennia with different languages. Tibetan Buddhism speaks of transforming poison into medicine, recognizing and constructively using even the most difficult emotions and tendencies. Western alchemy, which fascinated Jung tremendously, symbolically represented this process as transmuting lead, rejected aspects, into gold, integrated consciousness. Indicators of people who have genuinely begun this integration process are unmistakable. A peculiar combination of honesty about their shadows and compassion toward others' shadows. These people can admit their problematic impulses and tendencies without excessive shame or self-indulgence, simply as human condition aspects requiring constant awareness. Contemporary neuroscience has confirmed this integration process has observable neurophysiological correlates. Researchers like Daniel Siegel have documented how integrating previously dissociated experience aspects literally creates new neural connections between different brain regions, particularly between primitive emotional centers and prefrontal areas associated with self-reflection. What proves truly transformative about this process is that, paradoxically, consciously recognizing our most difficult aspects dramatically decreases likelihood of unconsciously acting them out. As Jungian analyst Robert Johnson observed, what we deny doesn't disappear. It simply emerges in forms over which we have less control. Conscious integration transforms potentially destructive psychic energy into available creative force. People who have genuinely initiated this inner work exhibit unique quality: ability to see the world in shades of gray instead of absolute black and white. They don't rigidly divide between good and bad, recognizing universal human complexity. As Jungian psychologist James Hollis pointed out, psychological maturity begins when we abandon fantasies of our absolute innocence. Authentic spiritual teachers throughout history have embodied this integration. The Dalai Lama can speak openly about his anger moments. Teresa of Avila recognized her spiritual aridity periods. Sufi mystic Rumi wrote poetically about his internal contradictions. This radical honesty contrasts dramatically with artificial perfection of those dissociated from their shadows. The most reliable integration in process indicator is peculiar combination of genuine humility, not false modesty, and authentic authority, not authoritarianism. Integrated people don't need to proclaim their goodness or wisdom because they've transcended needs for immaculate self-images. As Zen master Shunryu Suzuki expressed, in beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in expert's mind there are few. Before we conclude, have you recognized any of these signals in important people in your life? Or more importantly, have you detected aspects of these patterns in yourself? If this message resonated with you, write in the comments. Consciousness is transformation's first step. Don't forget to share this content with those who need to awaken to unconscious patterns in their relationships. Activate the notification bell and subscribe for more explorations of the fascinating Jungian.
Imagine if I revealed to you that your consciousness vibrates on a wavelength that only 1% of the world's population can truly decipher? That the reflections passing through your mind right now could constitute evidence of a psychic phenomenon that Carl Jung analyzed for entire decades. Contemporary investigations indicate that many of these exceptional consciousnesses concentrate around particular character structures, especially the INFJ and INEJ profiles that Jung himself would have identified. Stay here with me, because by the end of this content you'll understand if you possess one of the most unusual mental patterns known to mind science. And believe me, the 8th characteristic will radically transform your perception of your cognitive universe. But before continuing, like the video, share it with people who could benefit from it, and write in the comments which city you're following our YouTube channel from. Carl Jung stated, "The privilege of existence consists in becoming authentically oneself. But what happens when your true essence moves on a frequency that appears alien to everyone around you? What occurs when your consciousness processes reality through modalities that leave others bewildered, intimidated, or simply unable to follow your mental pathways?" According to Carl Jung, there exists a minuscule fraction of people whose minds operate through mechanisms radically different from the masses. These aren't simply intellectually gifted subjects. Intelligence is widespread. These are individuals whose awareness functions in dimensions that the majority of people can't even intuit, let alone decipher. But here's the fascinating aspect, and I'd like you to pay maximum attention to this point. Jung revealed that frequently these subjects don't even notice how particular their mental structure is. They spend years feeling like strangers, wondering why discussions seem superficial, why others seem unable to grasp obvious connections, why their intuitions are received with blank stares or embarrassing silences. Does this sound familiar? Keep following the content, because we're about to explore the 8 unmistakable indicators that prove your mind belongs to that elusive 1%. First indicator: you conceive patterns and connections that escape others. Carl Jung revealed that some individuals possess what he defined as inward-directed intuition, the ability to recognize patterns and connections that remain hidden from the majority of people. If you possess this type of mind, you don't just perceive isolated events or single pieces of information. You see the network that unites them all together. But it's precisely here that the situation becomes truly interesting. And this could clarify why you felt different your entire existence. When you participate in a conversation, while others focus on the words expressed, your mind simultaneously processes emotional nuances, historical context, psychic implications, and future consequences. You're not simply hearing what someone is saying. You're understanding what they mean to say, why they mean it, and what it reveals about their inner universe. According to Carl Jung, This ability derives from what he himself called the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche that the majority of people never access. Those with this rare mentality can draw from this reservoir of universal patterns and archetypal wisdom without even realizing it. Here's a test. When you watch a movie or read a book, do you find yourself anticipating plot twists not based on obvious clues, but because you intuit the underlying narrative pattern? Does it often happen that you complete others' sentences, not because you're telepathic, but because you can perceive the direction their thoughts are heading? If you're nodding, you're beginning to understand why 99% of people find your mind incomprehensible. You're operating on multiple levels simultaneously, while they're concentrated on just one. But wait, there's something even deeper about this pattern recognition ability discovered by Jung that leads us directly to the second indicator. Second signal. You perceive reality through overlapping layers. Carl Jung declared, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to understanding ourselves." But what happens when we naturally perceive these layers of meaning that Jung referred to, while others remain trapped on the surface? If you have this type of rare mind, you don't just experience events. You live the multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. When someone tells you they're fine, you don't just hear the word. You perceive the underlying emotional current, the body language that contradicts their statement, the active psychological defense mechanisms, and the deeper narrative their unconscious is trying to communicate. This is what Jung called deep psychological perception, and it's precisely why the majority of people can't understand your mind. While they process information sequentially and literally, you experience reality as a multidimensional fabric. Here's what's fundamental to understand, and this explains much of your existential experiences. When you try to share these layered insights with others, they often react with confusion or rejection. It's not because they lack intelligence. It's because they literally can't perceive the layers you're describing to them. Your insights seem to emerge from nowhere, as if you were creating non-existent connections. But Jung discovered something extraordinary in individuals with this cognitive pattern. They often become bridges between the conscious and unconscious worlds. They can translate the symbolic language of the psyche into concepts that others can begin to understand. Reflect on this. Do you naturally understand metaphors, symbols, and abstract concepts that others struggle with? Do you often communicate through stories, analogies, or examples because direct explanations don't seem to work? This brings us to an even more fascinating aspect of your unique mental architecture. Third signal. You're magnetically attracted to the dark side of human nature. According to Carl Jung, one of the most revealing indicators of a rare mind is an inexplicable fascination with what he called the shadow, the darker and hidden aspects of human nature that the majority of people desperately try to ignore or deny. If you possess this type of consciousness, you don't just recognize that everyone has a dark side. You're genuinely curious about it. You want to understand why people commit terrible actions, what drives destructive behaviors, and how the human psyche can contain such contradictions. But here's what makes all this truly extraordinary and why it disturbs so many people. While others are content to label certain behaviors as simply evil or wrong, your mind seeks to understand the underlying psychological mechanisms. You're not justifying harmful actions. You're trying to understand the human condition in its totality. Carl Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining luminous figures, but by making the darkness conscious." Your mind is naturally drawn to this process of making the unconscious conscious, of exploring the forbidden territories of the psyche. This is why you might feel attracted to complex and morally ambiguous characters in literature and cinema, drawn to crime stories not for their shocking value, but for psychological insights, fascinated by philosophy, psychology, and fields that explore the depths of human experience, and engaged by conversations on topics that others find uncomfortable or taboo. But here's the key insight Jung discovered. This fascination with the shadow isn't morbid curiosity. It's a sign of psychological maturity and integration. You understand that to truly know yourself and others, you must recognize the entire spectrum of human potential. The majority of people find this situation disturbing because they're still in a state of psychological splitting: good versus evil, right versus wrong, light versus darkness. Your mind has moved beyond these simplistic categories, reaching a more nuanced understanding of human nature. And this brings us to perhaps the most isolating aspect of having this type of rare consciousness. Fourth signal: you feel like you're speaking a different language. Carl Jung discovered that individuals with this rare cognitive pattern often experience what he called psychological loneliness, the feeling that no one truly understands the language of their inner world. If you have this type of mentality, you've probably lived through countless conversations where you felt like you were speaking in code. You share what seems like a simple observation only to receive blank stares or responses that didn't grasp the point at all. Here's what's happening at a deeper level, and this will explain much of your social experiences. Your mind naturally communicates through symbols, metaphors, and multilayered meanings. When you speak, you're not just transmitting information. You're transmitting entire conceptual frameworks, emotional plots, and insights. But the majority of people can only receive superficial and literal communications. According to Carl Jung, this communication gap isn't a flaw in your way of thinking. It's proof that your consciousness operates at a frequency that transcends ordinary awareness. You're like a radio station transmitting in HD, while most people only have AM receivers. Think about it. How many times have you simplified your thoughts just to be understood? How often do you find yourself saying, "never mind," because explaining your actual viewpoint would require too much context? This is why you might gravitate toward written communication, where you can elaborate your thoughts more carefully, prefer one-on-one conversations rather than group discussions, and find creative expression as a means to express what words can't capture, because sometimes it seems easier than trying to translate your inner world. But here's what Jung understood that most people don't. This communication challenge isn't an obstacle to overcome. It's a door to deeper understanding. Your unique language is an invitation for others to expand their consciousness. And this brings us to a sign that might surprise you. Fifth sign: you're not comfortable with pure logic. It might seem counterintuitive, but Carl Jung discovered that individuals with rare minds often feel limited by purely logical thinking. If you have this cognitive pattern, you don't reject logic. You recognize its limitations. While others rely on linear reasoning and cause and effect thinking, your mind operates through what Jung called intuitive logic, a form of understanding that incorporates emotions, symbolism, paradoxes, and nonlinear connections. Here's why this makes it so difficult for others to understand you. When faced with a problem, while others create logical sequences step by step, your mind processes multiple variables simultaneously. You're not just considering what makes logical sense, but also what feels right, what aligns with deeper patterns, and what respects the complexity of the situation. According to Carl Jung, this isn't an inferior way of thinking. It's a superior integration. You're not abandoning logic. You're placing it within a more complete framework that includes intuition, emotion, and unconscious wisdom. This is why you should trust your instinct even when you can't explain it logically. Learn to identify flaws in technically valid arguments that somehow miss the point. Prefer creative problem solving to mechanical rule application, and feel frustrated by people who ignore everything that can't be measured or quantified. But here's Jung's profound insight. This discomfort with pure logic isn't a weakness. It's a sign that your mind has integrated multiple ways of knowing to achieve a more complete understanding of reality. Most people operate based on logic or emotions, thinking or feelings, rationality or intuition. Your rare mind has learned to dance between these modalities, creating a symphony of understanding that sounds like chaos to those who can only hear one instrument at a time. And this integration leads us to one of the most powerful signs of this rare consciousness. Sixth signal: You see through social masks effortlessly. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to understanding ourselves." But what happens when we naturally perceive the masks people wear, the personalities they present to the world, and the authentic self hiding underneath? If you have this type of rare mind, you don't just notice when someone isn't being authentic. You can see the specific ways they're protecting themselves, the fears driving their behavior, and the genuine person struggling to emerge behind their social costume. This ability is both a gift and a burden. And here's why it makes you so incomprehensible to others. While most people accept social interactions for what they are, your mind constantly processes the subtext. You're reading micro-expressions, noticing congruence between words and body language, perceiving emotional undercurrents that completely escape others. According to Carl Jung, this perception derives from your natural access to what he called active imagination, the ability to see beyond the literal surface of things into their deeper psychological reality. But here's what's truly extraordinary. You don't just see through masks. You understand why people wear them. You recognize the protective function of personas, the vulnerability hiding behind defensive behaviors, and the universal human need to feel safe and accepted. This is why you might find yourself naturally becoming a confidant for others, even when you don't intend to. You might feel exhausted by social situations where everyone is performing, prefer authentic, vulnerable conversations to small talk, and sometimes know more about someone's inner state than they know about themselves. But here's the challenge Jung identified. This ability to see through social masks can create a profound sense of isolation. You're surrounded by people wearing costumes, speaking in code, and pretending to be someone they're not, and you're one of the few who can see the performance. This brings us to a sign that might explain some of your deepest struggles. Existential loneliness. Carl Jung discovered that individuals with this rare cognitive pattern often experience what he called existential loneliness, a profound sense of aloneness in the universe, not because they lack social connections, but because they perceive reality in ways that seem impossible to share. If you have this type of mind, you've probably felt this deep and painful isolation that has nothing to do with how many people surround you. You can be in a crowded room and still feel like the only person of your species on the planet. Here's what's happening at a psychological level, and this explains much of your inner experience. Your consciousness naturally gravitates toward the big questions. Why are we here? What is the meaning of existence? How do we reconcile the beauty and suffering of life? While others are content with surface-level living, your mind constantly grapples with the fundamental mysteries of existence. According to Carl Jung, this existential orientation isn't depression or morbidity. It's a sign of psychological depth and spiritual maturity. You don't settle for superficial answers because your mind demands authentic understanding. But here's the profound challenge. When you try to share these existential insights and questions with others, they often respond with discomfort, rejection, or attempts to redirect the conversation to more practical matters. This is why you might find yourself feeling more understood by books, art, or music than by people. You might find yourself seeking meaning in experiences others take for granted, questioning social assumptions everyone else accepts without thinking, and feeling like you're from another planet when others seem satisfied with superficial explanations. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you really are." But what happens when who you really are seems to exist in a dimension others can't perceive? This existential loneliness isn't a flaw in your psychology. It's proof that your consciousness has expanded beyond conventional boundaries of awareness. You're experiencing the vastness of existence, while others remain focused on the narrow circle of daily concerns. And this brings us to the final and deepest sign of this rare consciousness. Eighth signal, you're naturally drawn to transformation. Carl Jung discovered that the rarest minds are magnetically attracted to transformation. Not just personal growth, but the alchemical process of fundamental change he called individuation. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, you might be one of those rare individuals who embody what Jung called the introverted intuitive, someone naturally drawn to the depths of personal transformation. If you have this type of awareness, you don't just want to improve yourself. You feel called to completely transform who you are. You're attracted to experiences that destroy and rebuild you, challenge your fundamental assumptions about reality, and force you to confront the deepest aspects of your psyche. Here's what makes all this so extraordinary and why it terrifies most people. While others seek stability, predictability, and comfort, your mind craves the chaos of transformation. You're not afraid of psychological death and rebirth because you understand that's how authentic growth happens. According to Carl Jung, this attraction to transformation is the hallmark of what he called the individuated person, someone who has integrated their conscious and unconscious mind, embraced their shadow and light, and become a complete human being. But here's the profound insight Jung discovered. This process of transformation isn't optional for minds like yours. You're not choosing to go through intense periods of change. You're called by something deeper than your conscious will. This is why you might find yourself repeatedly drawn to experiences others would avoid, naturally seeking challenges that force you to grow, feeling restless when life becomes too comfortable or predictable, and understanding that crisis often precedes breakthrough. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Your rare mind doesn't just accept this challenge. It embraces it as the fundamental purpose of existence. Most people spend their lives avoiding transformation, clinging to familiar patterns and resisting the call to become who they truly are. Your consciousness operates from the awareness that transformation isn't something that happens to you. It's something you actively participate in as a co-creator of your becoming. So there you have it. The 8 unmistakable signs that you possess a mind that 99% of people simply cannot understand. If you've recognized yourself in these patterns, you're not alone in your uniqueness. You're part of a rare community of consciousness that Carl Jung spent his life studying and celebrating. But here's what I want you to understand in conclusion. Your different mind isn't a burden to bear. It's a gift to the world. Carl Jung discovered that individuals with this rare cognitive pattern often become bridges between the conscious and unconscious worlds, translators of the symbolic language of the psyche, and catalysts for transformation in others. Your ability to see patterns that others don't grasp, to perceive reality in layers, to understand the dark aspects of human nature, to speak the language of symbols and metaphors, to integrate multiple ways of knowing, to see through social masks, to confront existential questions, and to embrace transformation. These are not signs of brokenness or negative difference. They are signs that your consciousness has expanded beyond the normal boundaries of awareness.